Hey, this is part two of the road to World War II, and we're going to have some conversations about something we've already done. If you were around for the first one or you watched the first video, we talked about some of the things that happened that would take us from World War One on this pathway that eventually take us to a World War II. Roughly 20 years after the First War. Now, the First War, if you remember those conversations, you've done any research about that, that was supposed to be the war that end all wars. And unfortunately, Americans, Europeans, everyone in the world, we just didn't learn our lesson from the pain and destruction that happened from this one. So we had to do it again. And of course, it was even worse than the first one. So when we talk about each one of these, I got us through this in the first video because I didn't want to overwhelm you if you were trying to put this thing together. And I also didn't know how this was going to be used. If you're teaching in a class, you might have wanted to use different details to kind of connect these. As I listed these, I don't think a lot of historians are going to argue that these are all on the list of variables or factors or things that would have led us to World War II. But how you interpret and connect these together may vary from teacher to teacher. So I wanted to make sure you had a blank slate. And if you want to take a quick picture of this or do something with it, you can use on your own. Do it how you want. But either way, we're going to go ahead and we're going to go and fill it in from what we know. All right. And let's start with the Treaty of Versailles, because we have Treaty of Versailles. We talk about an economic downturn, how that's connected to a rise of extremism. That's connected to the rise of Nazi ideology. And Nazi ideologies are sets of ideas. Ideology is a set of idea. Oh, doesn't want to work. And then we have forging alliances. You have something called Lebensraum. And then you have failure of appeasement. And then takes us to World War II. So let's take these on little by little. Okay, Treaty of Versailles gets a lot of blame here when we talk about World War II. And when the war was happening, you had two sides. You had the Central Powers, and that's Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. And you had the Allies, which were England and France and Russia and eventually the United States. And as the war transpired, Russia got knocked out in 1917. You have Austrian-Hungarian Empire just pretty much disintegrating. Ottoman Empire didn't survive it. And so as we're going back and forth, it comes down to the French, the English, the Germans, and then eventually the Americans. And there's lots of other little countries involved, but those are the big players. Well, America's involvement in this war starting in 1917 really put the Germans in a bad spot. They couldn't match the industrialization that America brought to the table. They couldn't match all the supplies and extra guns and weapons. They'd been fighting France and and England to a stalemate to where they're even, where both sides were just, they couldn't win. Having that extra support from the United States kind of pushed the Allies over the edge. And so eventually, Germany would lose the war. And they would ask for something called an armistice, which is an end of the war, a ceasefire. As all these winners start getting together, they've got to find somebody to blame for all the people who died in this war. And the only person left, or the only group left, was the country of Germany, because all their allies had pretty much fallen apart. So the Treaty of Versailles really blamed Germany for the war. And because they are the ones that caused the war, supposedly, the Treaty of Versailles want to punish them. And when I say punish them, I mean they literally put on huge restrictions on Germany as to the kind of military they can have, the kind of air force they could have. They took land from them that was really important to the German economy. And they made Germany pay huge payments called reparations to pay back the Allies for the cost of the war. Well, all these restrictions and all these punishments, basically, they created something called hyperinflation. And this is tied to something we call an economic downturn. And if you know anything about inflation, you know it means the cost of goods just go up. I remember reading somewhere that in 1912, I think the German money, which is called a German mark, was worth the 3 German marks equaled $1 American. And by 1922, $1 American equaled 42 trillion German marks. So I can tell you, it had a huge impact on their economy. And it caused massive unemployment, which means people were extremely dissatisfied. And this means people don't have jobs. They don't have a work. They don't have a way to feed their family or earn. And because of this, the German people suffered. Not only did they lose a war that they didn't feel like they actually lost, but now they were almost ashamed to be Germans. And they were forced into some really, really tough economic times. And they wanted to blame somebody. So they blamed their leaders. And their leadership was actually something called the Weimar Republic. And we won't get into that specifically, but they had to blame somebody. And so them blaming their government allowed for a lot of strong voices to come out of nowhere and be heard. And people started listening because at this point, they're getting pretty desperate and they know anything's going to be better than what they got. And some of these people were very extreme. And eventually this led to these extreme voices to take control of Germany. And I'm going to stop right there. I was going to say Germany, but you know what? That wasn't just Germany. That was happened to Italy too. The same thing happened in Italy. Italy was running through some of the same problems. They were very unhappy with the terms of World War One, even though they were on the winning side. They still didn't get anything out of it, and they were dealing with their own economic problems, just like everybody else in Europe was starting to. So these things right here, and I'll go back to extreme people. The people we really kind of think about are people like Mussolini, Hitler, a guy named Franco in Spain, Joseph Stalin. These are people who would become big names when we talk about the actual war. But right now, we don't have time for that, okay? But I do want to make connection there. Okay, so that does takes us down to our let's get specific though with Nazi ideology. And this Nazi ideology specifically was part of this extremist point of views. And they were really strong nationalists. People wanted to have pride in their country. The Nazi Party says, hey, we want to give you pride in your country because you are better than other countries. In fact, you're not only better, you are racially superior, which means there's nobody better than you. And this goes to this whole idea of this blonde hair, blue eye, Aryan mythology of a secret race of people who were the ancestors of the German society. And this led to Germany looking at themselves saying, listen, it couldn't have been our fault. We couldn't have been the problem. It has to be somebody else. Oh, I know who it is. It's those Jewish people. And you have this huge rise of something called anti-Semitism. It can't be our fault. It must be the fault of the Jewish people. And so the Jewish people become known as a scapegoat. A scapegoat is not a word I'm going to write down, but a scapegoat is the one who gets blamed for things. This also allows for something known as totalitarianism. And I know I've made another video about totalitarianism. I encourage you to watch this because this just really hammers out Nazi Germany was the poster child for totalitarianism, but it's also something that Mussolini followed, Joseph Stalin followed, Fidel Castro in Cuba would follow. North Korea has this stuff going on. It's Hitler wasn't the only one, but Hitler really did it to such a massive effect, and he used it in such a way that's really stands out in history. Okay, so we talked about these totalitarian leaders. They kind of decided to bind together because they all had this idea in their minds of expanding their countries. So when we talk about forging alliance, we're going to talk about Germany made agreements, or I'm going to say deals. Can we say deals? Deals of support or non-aggression. That means they agree not to fight each other. With Italy, Japan, and Russia. Now, I would love to give you details right now about how Russia really got tricked because Hitler was so good at lying to people. And he really, really prized the German people, but he felt it was okay to lie to everybody else. And he had lied to Russia and said, hey, if you don't attack us, we won't attack you. Well, that sounded good until he decided to attack Russia. And that led to all kinds of other problems, and that brought the Russians into the war on the side of the Allies. But that's something we'll talk about later on in a different video. Okay, so with all these new alliances and these non-aggression pacts, Hitler felt bold enough to expand. And when I say expand, I'm talking about growing Germany. That's important to know that because Hitler believed the Aryan race, for it to survive, would have to grow and expand. And there's a lot of crazy things that were going on to support that idea. And we probably will never get into it because some of it, to be honest with you, is probably a little too racy for me to talk about in these videos. But they had a lot of plans. Let's put it that way. But this whole concept is something called Lebensraum. Lebensraum means living space. That's something we've already talked about briefly, right? I want to make sure I give you extra notice about totalitarianism. And I'm going to cover that with a red because that is one that leads us to some conflict. Okay, so we're all still together, right? Lebensraum. You've got Treaty of Versailles. People are feeling bad about themselves. Economic downturn. People are unemployed. Hyperinflation. They can't afford food. They can't afford toilet paper. So these extreme ideas come up. Tell everybody, hey, you're wonderful. You can be great. Follow our ideas. Oh, and by the way, we're going to blame everything on the Jews. And these leaders decided to bind together. And Hitler, feeling pretty bold, says, you know what? We just need a little more living space called Lebensraum. Okay. This takes us to what's going on in Europe. And after World War I, most of these countries did not really want to go to war again because they remembered how bad the First War was. So you've got France and England, well, your two main European countries. They really wanted to avoid war again. And so they said, okay, Adolf, what do you want? What's going to make you happy? And Hitler says, hey, I just want Czechoslovakia. That's it. Just give me Czechoslovakia. and I can be happy, and we'll have our Lebensraum, and we can move on, and everybody will be peaceful, and there'll be no war. And so the powers that be agreed, say, okay, that's all you want? Peace in Europe. We're going to give it to him. Now, of course, nobody informed Czechoslovakia, but either way, the deed was done. So Hitler had taken Austria because he annexed Austria. He took Czechoslovakia without firing a shot. And then what happens next? Oh, by the way, this process of giving Hitler what he wanted, that's called appeasement. Okay. You give him what he wants, that's called appeasement. Hope those errors don't confuse you, but I want to make sure we make that connection. If you don't know what appeasement is, just picture yourself at the grocery store with your little brother, little sister. They're crying for something, and your mom and dad just is here. Just have it. If it shuts you up, you'll have it. Well, we appease people all the time. You give in to them, and that's exactly what they did to Hitler. They gave in to him. Instead of having this idea that they were going to control Hitler or limit him, it emboldened Hitler even more. And there's an old phrase: "Give a mouse a cookie, he's going to want a glass of milk," or "Give a mouse a cookie, he's going to want to." I say that already? I don't care. Either way, he wanted more. This led to the invasion of Poland. And at this point, everybody realizes that Hitler is not going to be appeased. And thus, you see the beginning of World War II. Now, there's a lot of conversations we can have about World War II, and we'll get there eventually in different videos. But just know when Hitler invaded Poland, he introduced something called blitzkrieg, which is like a lightning attack. And Poland only lasted for 3 days. They were shocked by what happened in Poland. And to be honest with you, the Allies just weren't really all that prepared to fight a war, especially with a country that was so aggressive with what they wanted to have happen. And there's a lot of hardship that took place during World War I because of that unreadiness. So we'll talk about that in a different video, but know that all these things combined, and I have to keep going back to Hitler, have to keep going back to Germany, because if we don't make those connections, we'll really fail to understand this lead up from one war to the next. And that's it. That's my short video. Use this as you can. Use it how you want to. If you have any questions, obviously, try to send me an email through whatever I got going on with this YouTube channel if I can figure out how to read them. Thank you very much, and have a good night.